Hi guys, Matt Easton here. So what I have in my hands here is the diary of Charles John Griffiths, the book itself is called Sepoys, Siege and Storm, and it's his account of the Siege of Delhi during the Indian Mutiny in 1857. Any of my regular viewers will know that I have a personal fascination with the Indian Mutiny and the Sikh Wars and this kind of mid-19th century kind of colonial conflict. And in this account he describes his experiences before, during and after the Siege of Delhi. He was in the 61st Regiment of Foot, and I'll just read a little bit of text. This is before the mutiny broke out, and he says, Vickers and I, Vickers being the adjutant of the 61st Regiment of Foot, Vickers and I were in the habit since the hot weather began of making ices, that being ice cream, every afternoon, and had become from long practice quite proficient at the work. At 3 o'clock we were in the midst of our occupation, our whole thoughts and energies bent on the accomplishment of our task. Clad in loose deshabille, seated on the floor of the sitting room, we worked and watched the process of congelation. So they're sitting there happily enjoying, well, maybe not enjoying, but tolerating the hot weather during India's summer, and making ice creams using the congelation process, which I don't know how that works. But why am I reading you an account of someone making ice creams? Well, very simply because to illustrate that history can sometimes very nicely connect with antiques, and this diary is inextricably connected to one of the swords behind me. Can you guess which one? It's actually the one at the bottom. Why? Because the sword at the bottom, and I'll take it off the wall here, actually belonged to Henry Vickers, mentioned in that diary, and he's mentioned all the way through it, who was the adjutant of the 61st Regiment of Foot. This is not the sword that he had at that time during the Siege of Delhi. It's actually a sword that he ordered from Wilkinson in the following year, in 1858. I have yet to establish exactly why he ordered a new sword. It's entirely possible that his previous sword got broken or lost or damaged, or simply that he wanted a better sword. Now, what is this video actually about? It's actually about the fact that my exact specialisation of interest in something that I'm writing a book about is non-regulation or special regulation, depending how you want to term it, officers' swords of the 19th century. This is not a standard infantry officer's sword. Now, companies like Wilkinson's sword were kind of the top end, one of the best makers in Britain, in fact the world, for swords at this time. They offered various optional extras, as it were. Much like buying a car today, you might choose to get it with front parking sensors as well as rear parking sensors, or with leather seats, or with a sunroof, or whatever. And in those days you could buy a standard regulation officer's sword, or you could get optional extras added to it. This has a couple, in fact 3 main optional extras added to it that I'll just run you through. If I dispense with the scabbard, because the scabbard is utterly standard. Yes, that was a swing noise. Put the scabbard down there. Right, so the first thing to mention is the blade is longer than usual. Okay, the normal regulation infantry officer's sword blade was 32.5 inches long, sometimes 33 inches. This is 34.5 inches long, so it's actually a cavalry length blade. Okay, so that's the first thing, it's a longer blade than normal. In actual fact, Henry Vickers, as adjutant of the 61st Regiment of Foot, spent a lot of time riding around on a horse and conveying information from one group of people to another. So in actual fact, the fact that he spent a lot of time on a horse and he might find himself fighting on a horse, it makes a certain degree of sense, despite the fact that on paper he was an infantry officer, to have a blade that was a little bit longer and therefore more useful on horseback. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, you'll notice it has no fuller. What is a fuller? Well, I'm sure most of you know. I'll just put this sword down for a second. If I just grab this sword, there we go. A fuller is a groove in the blade. Okay, so it's this sometimes called a blood groove, which it shouldn't be called, groove running down the blade, and it essentially makes a structure a bit like an I-beam. It means that you can make a blade that's light and stiff at the same time. This does not have that. It has what's known as a flat solid blade, and this is actually exactly like many cutlasses. If I just pick up a cutlass, this is actually a lead cutter that I've shown in a previous video, but you'll notice that the cutlass or lead cutter swords are completely flat with no fuller. Henry Vickers' sword is like that. Why would you choose a flat solid blade instead of the fullered type? There are several possible reasons. Often presentation swords were of this flat solid type blade. One argument has been made that they are better for etching on because they're flat instead of having the cross section of a fullered blade, so it's easier to put more complex etching on. That doesn't really apply to this sword because the etching on it is actually, although it's quite elaborate, it's quite restricted in area and it's not very different to a standard infantry officer's sword. So this one's not for etching. I actually think the main reason is because it makes for a better cutter. What I mean by that, if I just put the sword down again and I show you my hand. So when you have a blade which has a fuller in a portion of the cross section, it means that the angle between the flat faces coming to the edge are a little bit broader. Now clearly a sharpened edge on any sword can be equally sharp, in other words kind of one steel molecule wide at the edge. However, with the flat solid blade what you're doing is you're bringing that angle into a more acute kind of gradient. Okay, so what you're doing is you're making an edge which after the initial sharpness of the edge has a more gradual slope to it rather than the more abrupt slope of a fullered blade. Okay, so that's one possible reason, and in fact this has been produced to be sharpened from the outset. So my belief is that Henry Vickers, based on his experience during the Indian Mutiny and being based in India, seeing what tulwars and other Indian swords, how effective they were, probably wanted a sword that was better at cutting than the standard regulation infantry officer's sword. Finally, the other thing that's non-regulation about it is infantry officers' swords, if I just grab one here, have a brass hilt. Okay, you'll notice that the hilt is cast brass. Now, cast brass hilts have one good advantage in that they don't rust. Okay, you can handle them as much as you like and they're not going to corrode, they're not going to get rusty. The blade is safely in the scabbard, so you can walk around in the rain, you can be in moist environments and not really worry about your sword because the blade is protected and everything on the outside is more or less waterproof. If you have a steel scabbard, you can paint it black, it's not a problem. So the hilt, at least, you don't have to worry about rusting. However, the disadvantage of a brass hilt is that it was noted, especially in India but also in the Sudan wars, that brass hilts could occasionally be cut through or broken or bent during combat. Now, very clearly a stronger material to make your hilt out of is steel, and so the final non-regulation aspect of Henry Vickers' sword is that whilst it looks gold in colour, that is because, and I'll show the inside where you can probably see it more clearly, it is gold in colour, it's essentially gold plated, okay? It's gilt. But the material of the guard is steel. The back strap is steel, the ferrule up there is steel, obviously the pommel is part of the back strap, so that's steel, and the guard itself is steel. Okay? The entire thing has been cut out of steel, then covered in copper to provide a kind of adhesive surface for the gilding, and then gilded over the top. So, we've got three non-regulation aspects of this sword. It's longer than normal, it's a different cross section, it's flat, much like a tulwar or a cutlass, and the guard is steel instead of brass. So very clearly to me this is what I would term a fighting sword, based on his experiences during the siege of Delhi. And incidentally, it's not only Charles John Griffiths mentions him in his diaries, but also Hodson of Hodson's Horse, very famous cavalry commander. He also mentions Vickers in passing as well during the siege of Delhi. So based on Vickers' experiences in the siege of Delhi, for numerous reasons probably, that we may never know exactly why, he chose to get a non-regulation fighting sword. And these are the type of swords that I am especially interested in, because they show an officer having a greater degree of interest in their sword, and probably swordsmanship, than the average officer out there during the period, many of whom just relied on their pistols and revolvers if they could get them. Okay, so there we go. There's one of my swords from the wall, tell you a bit of its history, and it's linked, luckily for me, to two published works which mention Henry Vickers, and in fact I have copies of Henry Vickers' own diaries which I'm in the process of transcribing, and I will publish myself as well. Thanks guys!